Gerald Vance had spent 20 years navigating the complex and often unforgiving corridors of federal procurement. And he had learned that in the defense industry, personal trust was the only currency that never inflated. At 49 years old, he was a retired Navy logistics officer who had spent the last 2 decades building the government contracting division of Brewster Defense Systems from a minor regional subcontractor into a formidable defense partner. His credentials were impeccable, including a top-secret security clearance, with sensitive compartmented information access. This designation had required 3 years of exhaustive background investigations, neighborhood interviews, and polygraph tests, followed by constant reinvestigations. It was the kind of security clearance that money could not buy and corporate pressure could not expedite. Yet, as he sat in the mahogany-paneled conference room C at the Pentagon, he watched Chad Montgomery, the newly appointed vice president of the division, attempt to explain the complex technical specifications of the AN/FPS 132 early warning radar upgrade proposal. Chad had arrived 20 minutes late, smelling of a heavy cologne and a long networking lunch in Georgetown. He had bypassed the technical slides, which detailed the phased array transceiver elements and signal processing algorithms, and immediately began displaying high-level corporate diagrams about synergy and operational agility. Gerald sat quietly, his fingers steepled, watching the expressions of the military personnel across the table. Colonel Eleanor Sinclair, an Air Force acquisition veteran who had spent 28 years managing aerospace procurement, was not impressed. She had come up through the military academy, survived multiple combat deployments, and had little patience for corporate jargon. The other 3 acquisition officers in the room were staring at their tablets, their expressions vacant. Gerald had spent 8 years working directly with Colonel Sinclair, establishing a rapport based on absolute technical accuracy and transparent communication. When Chad paused to take a sip of water, Colonel Sinclair leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she looked at the slide. She asked Chad if he could explain how the proposed upgrade would handle the specific electromagnetic interference issues associated with the high-frequency radar array. Chad smiled his polished, business school smile, adjusting his tie, and said that their technical teams would optimize those parameters during the implementation phase. He then added that their primary focus was aligning the strategic timeline with cost reduction protocols. Colonel Sinclair did not smile back. She asked Chad directly if his security clearance allowed him to access the classified technical manual for the transceiver module, as the integration requirements were restricted to cleared personnel. Chad, who possessed no security clearance and had never served a day in uniform, hesitated for a fraction of a second before claiming that his role was to provide strategic oversight rather than get bogged down in the minute details of the engineering files. He then turned to Gerald and said that Gerald should step back and let the grown-ups handle this presentation. The words hung in the quiet room like a sudden drop in cabin pressure. The air conditioning hummed softly in the background, but otherwise the room went dead silent. The other Air Force officers looked up from their screens, their eyes wide with disbelief. Gerald kept his voice perfectly level, suggesting that they discuss the division of labor outside the Pentagon briefing room. Chad dismissed the suggestion immediately, stating that they simply needed to manage their technical staff with greater discipline to ensure corporate alignment. Colonel Sinclair stood up slowly, closing her folder, with a sharp snap that sounded like a pistol shot in the quiet room. She looked at Chad with cold indifference, then turned her gaze to Gerald. She announced that the meeting was concluded and requested that Gerald call her directly. When he was prepared to present the actual technical specifications without further interruption. After the military personnel had filed out of the room, Chad attempted to frame the encounter as a success, asserting that he had successfully established the proper corporate hierarchy and shown the client who was in charge of the contract. Gerald did not argue. He packed his laptop into his leather briefcase, zipped it shut, and walked out of the building. He drove home in silence, the afternoon traffic on the interstate giving him ample time to reflect on his career. He had started at Brewster Defense Systems when the founder, Harvey Brewster, had hired him to build the government division. In those early years, Gerald had been the division, traveling to test ranges in the middle of the night and writing proposals on his kitchen table. Now, he was being treated like an administrative subordinate by a manager who did not know the difference between a radar transceiver and a microwave transmitter. Brenda had noticed his frustration building over the last 2 years, ever since the restructuring began. Chad Montgomery had spent his first month on the job questioning Gerald's travel expenses and asking why they could not automate the relationship management process. To Chad, the procurement officers were not partners in national security. They were simply accounts on a spreadsheet to be managed through standardized communication templates and quarterly reviews. Gerald had tried to explain the unique nature of the defense sector, but Chad had dismissed his advice as outdated thinking. Now, after the humiliation at the Pentagon, Gerald realized that the division he had spent 20 years building was being steered toward a major disaster by a man who did not even know what he did not know. He sat in his car for a long time before turning the key, listening to the hum of the engine and realizing that his loyalty to the company had finally reached its limit. Brewster Defense Systems was no longer the firm Harvey Brewster had founded. It had become a playground for corporate theory, and Gerald was no longer willing to protect it from its own bad decisions. That evening, Gerald sat in his garage, meticulously cleaning and organizing his socket wrenches. It was a therapeutic routine he had developed during his Navy years to clear his mind after difficult shifts. His wife, Brenda Vance, came out and sat on the edge of his workbench, holding 2 mugs of black coffee. She did not ask how the meeting went. She could tell from the deliberate way he was wiping down the metal tools. Brenda knew about the mounting pressure at Brewster Defense Systems. The company had undergone a massive restructuring 2 years ago, bringing in Chad Montgomery, who held a Master of Business Administration from Vanderbilt and had previously managed commercial real estate portfolios. Chad had immediately set about trying to standardize and centralize all government accounts, viewing the highly specialized field of defense contracting through the lens of corporate efficiency and margin optimization. Gerald explained the confrontation in the Pentagon briefing room, recounting Chad's patronizing comment in front of Colonel Sinclair. Brenda listened patiently, her expression serious. Brenda reminded Gerald of their financial obligations. Their daughter, Chloe Vance, was completing her senior year at Oak Ridge High and had already received acceptance letters from several universities, including Virginia Tech, which would require significant tuition payments. Their son, Toby Vance, was a high school sophomore who had just made the varsity football team and needed specialized training camps and equipment. They still owed $285,000 on their mortgage, and the prospect of changing careers at this stage in life was daunting. However, Brenda also pointed out that 20 years of dedication deserved respect, and that Chad's arrogance was starting to threaten the very contracts that funded the company. The next morning, Colonel Sinclair called Gerald's personal cell phone. She was direct, asking if Harvey Brewster understood the risks of putting an uncleared manager in charge of a classified radar upgrade contract. Gerald attempted to defend the company, but Sinclair cut him off, stating that the military could not afford to work with contractors who valued corporate structure over security compliance and technical expertise. The situation deteriorated further 3 days later when Chad called a division-wide meeting. He announced a new policy called Client Relationship Optimization, which mandated that all communications with government clients be routed through his office first. He explained that this would ensure a unified corporate message and prevent technical staff from discussing project parameters without strategic oversight. Gerald raised his hand and pointed out that many of their government clients, including the procurement officers at Aberdeen Proving Ground and Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, required direct, immediate contact with cleared technical leads to resolve engineering issues. Chad dismissed the objection, stating that their clients would have to adjust to professional business standards and that personal relationships were secondary to contract structure. That afternoon, Gerald received a call from Lawrence Dunlap, the chief executive officer of Apex Defense Solutions, Brewster's primary competitor. Lawrence was straightforward, offering Gerald a director-level position, a 60% salary increase, a substantial signing bonus, and a clear path to partnership with equity in the firm. The final turning point came the following Monday during a senior leadership meeting with Harvey Brewster. Chad presented a proposal to restructure the government division, which included consolidating all client relationships under his direct control and bringing in external consultants to streamline the bidding process. Gerald listened to the presentation for 30 minutes before asking Harvey if he realized that Chad lacked the necessary security clearance to manage the active contracts, and that the clients would not accept a manager who could not participate in classified briefings. Chad reacted defensively, asserting that government contracting was not complex engineering, and that anyone with basic business skills could manage the division. He then looked directly at Gerald and said that Gerald was not some irreplaceable genius, and that the company could easily find someone else to run the contracts. Gerald looked at Harvey, but the founder remained silent, nodding in agreement with Chad's strategic assessment. Gerald stood up, adjusted his suit jacket, and said that they should find out if that was true. He walked out of the conference room and called Lawrence Dunlap from his vehicle. After hanging up with Lawrence, Gerald sat in his truck in the parking lot, watching the glass facade of the Brewster building reflect the gray autumn sky. He felt a sudden, unexpected sense of relief washing over him. For 20 years, he had carried the weight of the division on his shoulders, worrying about contract deadlines, security audits, and the livelihoods of the 40 engineers and administrators who worked under him. He had stayed loyal to Harvey Brewster out of a sense of duty, believing that the founder valued the sacrifices they had made to build the business. But seeing Harvey sit in silence while Chad dismissed his 20 years of expertise had shattered any remaining loyalty. Gerald realized that the company he had helped build no longer existed. It had been replaced by a corporate shell that valued financial spreadsheets over human capital and technical competence. He drove home, discussed the offer with Brenda once more, and began drafting his resignation letter. They spent the weekend reviewing their finances, checking their savings accounts, and planning for the transition. With Brenda's full and unwavering support, Gerald prepared to make the leap to Apex Defense Solutions, confident that his reputation and relationships would speak for themselves in the industry. On Friday morning, Gerald walked into Harvey Brewster's office and delivered a brief, 2-sentence resignation letter, effective immediately. Harvey was stunned, his face turning pale as he read the document. He attempted to negotiate, offering to discuss a salary adjustment or a modified reporting structure, but Gerald politely declined, stating that he had accepted a position with Apex Defense Solutions. Gerald spent the next 2 hours packing 20 years of personal files, technical reference manuals, and reference notes into 3 cardboard boxes. He left the official contract database intact on the company's server. But he knew that the true value of the division was not in the digital files, but in the trust he had built with procurement officials over 2 decades. As he loaded the boxes into his truck, Chad Montgomery watched from the office window, his expression a mix of irritation and indifference. Chad believed that the division would run more smoothly without Gerald's resistance to his modern management methods. And he immediately assigned himself as the interim lead for all major government contracts. The consequences of Gerald's departure manifested almost immediately. On Monday morning, Gerald began his new role at Apex Defense Solutions, where Lawrence Dunlap had already prepared a spacious office and a dedicated team for him. Within hours, Gerald received a text message from Colonel Sinclair, asking to discuss the radar project timeline. When Gerald informed her of his move to Apex Defense Solutions, she immediately contacted the procurement office. The next day, Brewster Defense Systems received formal notice that their bid for the $47 million radar upgrade contract was disqualified due to their failure to provide a qualified, cleared technical lead as specified in the request for proposal. Colonel Sinclair then recommended that the contract be awarded to Apex Defense Solutions, which now employed the primary architect of the technical proposal. the fallout did not stop there. Major Beatrice Ramirez, the procurement director at Aberdeen Proving Ground, called a meeting to review an $18 million testing facility upgrade that Brewster was scheduled to perform. Upon learning that Gerald was no longer managing the project, Major Ramirez suspended the contract, citing a lack of confidence in Brewster's technical leadership and security compliance under Chad's management. By Wednesday afternoon, the Huntsville Procurement Office had suspended negotiations on a $12 million radar calibration contract, and Wright-Patterson Air Force Base had canceled a preliminary briefing for a $25 million logistics project. In less than 48 hours, Brewster Defense Systems had lost $77 million in active and pending contracts. The corporate headquarters was thrown into a state of panic. Harvey Brewster called Gerald's personal phone repeatedly, leaving increasingly desperate messages. When Gerald finally answered on Friday evening, Harvey pleaded with him to return, offering him Chad's position, a 70% salary increase, and an equity stake in the company. Gerald listened quietly before explaining that the issue was not about money, but about competence. Gerald pointed out to Harvey that Chad Montgomery did not have the security clearance required to view the technical documentation for the radar project, and that obtaining such a clearance would take a minimum of 18 months, assuming it was approved at all. He explained that Colonel Sinclair and the other procurement officers did not have the time or the inclination to wait for Chad to learn the industry, especially when Apex Defense Solutions was ready to execute the work immediately. Gerald told Harvey that Chad had spent 2 years undervaluing the technical expertise and relationships that kept the company solvent, and that the board would now have to decide if Chad's business degree was worth the $77 million in lost revenue. He then hung up the phone and returned to his family, leaving Harvey to face the consequences of his decisions. The next morning, the local business journal published an article detailing the sudden shift in government defense contracts, noting that Apex Defense Solutions had emerged as the dominant contractor in the region. The rapid collapse of Brewster's government business sent shockwaves through the local defense contracting community. For years, Brewster had been viewed as an untouchable titan in the sector, but the sudden loss of their primary contracts revealed the fragile foundation upon which their success had been built. Industry analysts quickly found out that in the specialized world of defense procurement, corporate infrastructure was meaningless, without the personal relationships and technical expertise required to navigate the federal bureaucracy. At Apex Defense Solutions, Gerald was greeted with enthusiasm by his new colleagues, who recognized that his arrival had single-handedly transformed the company's competitive position. Lawrence Dunlap wasted no time in integrating Gerald into their strategic planning sessions, giving him full authority to expand their government division and hire additional personnel to manage the incoming workload. Gerald felt a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that his expertise was not only valued but considered essential to the company's future growth. He walked through the halls of Apex, noting the contrast between the vibrant, engineering-focused culture of his new home and the sterile, corporate atmosphere that Chad had imposed on the team he had left behind, which had slowly drained the morale of every developer and analyst in the building. Faced with the collapse of their government division, Harvey Brewster and Chad Montgomery attempted to launch a legal retaliation against Gerald. On Tuesday morning, Gerald was served with a lawsuit alleging that he had breached his fiduciary duty to Brewster Defense Systems, violated the non-compete clause in his employment agreement, and misappropriated proprietary trade secrets by transferring client relationships to Apex Defense Solutions. The lawsuit demanded an immediate injunction to prevent Gerald from working on any government contracts for the competitor. However, Gerald and his legal team were prepared. His attorney, a seasoned federal contract specialist, drafted a comprehensive response that turned the legal battle into an absolute disaster for Brewster Defense Systems. First, they demonstrated that the non-compete clause was legally unenforceable under state law because it was overly broad, lacked reasonable geographic limitations, and attempted to restrict Gerald's employment in a highly specialized field where security clearances are personal assets tied to the individual rather than corporate property. Second, they introduced evidence that Chad Montgomery had violated federal security regulations by attempting to access classified documents related to the radar contract without possessing the necessary security clearance. Gerald's attorney prepared a formal disclosure to the Defense Security Service, documenting Chad's attempts to pressure administrative staff to bypass security protocols. Furthermore, they pointed out that Chad had made false statements to Colonel Sinclair regarding his clearance status during the Pentagon briefing, which constituted a direct violation of Title 18, United States Code, Section 1001, a federal offense carrying penalties of up to 5 years in prison. The legal team also prepared a counter-complaint detailing Brewster's violations of the Worker Adjustment and Retraining Notification Act, codified under Title 29, United States Code, Section 2101. During the restructuring 2 years prior, Brewster had terminated 55 administrative and technical support workers in the government division without providing the mandatory 60 days written notice, exposing the company to massive back pay liability. Additionally, they uncovered evidence that Chad Montgomery had attempted to cover up his management failures by altering internal project logs and forging compliance and signatures on several pending proposals. Under the State Penal Code, Section 470, the falsification of corporate records with the intent to defraud constituted a felony. When Gerald's attorney presented this evidence to Brewster's corporate counsel during a preliminary deposition, the reaction was immediate. The opposing lawyers realized that continuing the lawsuit would expose the company to federal criminal investigations, immediate contract debarment by the Department of Defense, and millions of dollars in fines and back pay liabilities. The board of directors at Brewster Defense Systems was convened in an emergency session that lasted late into the night. They realized that Chad's attempt to sue Gerald had instead exposed the company to corporate ruin. They ordered their legal team to immediately withdraw the lawsuit with prejudice and begin negotiating a settlement to avoid federal prosecution and public disclosure of the security violations. The board members were furious with Chad, who had assured them that the lawsuit would force Gerald to return, or at least prevent him from working for Apex Defense Solutions. Instead, Chad's aggressive legal strategy had acted as a catalyst, bringing all of Brewster's internal compliance failures and regulatory violations into the light. The company's general counsel made it clear that if the case went to court, the public record would destroy whatever remaining reputation the company had in the defense sector, making it impossible to win future contracts even in their commercial division. Harvey Brewster sat in silence as the board members debated how to salvage the company. He realized that by trusting Chad's corporate theories over Gerald's 20 years of practical experience, he had allowed his company to be dragged to the brink of bankruptcy. The board voted unanimously to strip Chad of all authority and initiated an internal audit to uncover the full extent of his document alterations and security breaches. Preparing to cooperate fully with federal investigators in a desperate attempt to mitigate the damage, the legal counterattack was not just a defensive maneuver, it was a masterclass in using Brewster's own corporate negligence as a strategic weapon. Gerald's attorney had painstakingly compiled a list of every administrative failure that had occurred under Chad's brief tenure. They documented instances where project timelines had been altered in official reports to hide delays, and where junior engineers without appropriate clearances were assigned to tasks that required access to restricted technical drawings. By presenting these findings during the initial discovery phase, Gerald's legal team made it clear that any attempt by Brewster to pursue their claims would result in a public trial, where the company's internal operations would be laid bare. The threat of contract debarment was the ultimate leverage. Under federal procurement rules, any company facing active criminal investigations for security violations or fraud can be suspended from bidding on new contracts. The board members, representing shareholders who had invested millions in Brewster recognized that saving Chad's ego was not worth the total destruction of the company's enterprise value, and they moved swiftly to contain the self-inflicted crisis, completely abandoning the lawsuit. The final resolution of the conflict occurred 2 weeks later in the executive conference room of Apex Defense Solutions. Harvey Brewster, accompanied by his lead attorney, sat across the table from Lawrence Dunlap and Gerald. Harvey looked exhausted, his hair unkempt and his posture defeated. He presented a proposal to subcontract Brewster's remaining government division assets and contracts to Apex Defense Solutions in exchange for a 30% revenue share. Gerald spoke on behalf of Apex, rejecting the proposal outright. He explained that the government clients had made it clear that they would only work with Apex Defense Solutions, and that Brewster had no leverage left to negotiate. Gerald then presented an asset purchase agreement, offering to acquire Brewster's physical government division assets, office leases, and specialized testing equipment for a fraction of their market value. The agreement also mandated that Apex would hire the remaining administrative and technical staff from Brewster, protecting their livelihoods. The board of Brewster Defense Systems accepted the terms the following afternoon, realizing they had no other choice. Chad Montgomery was terminated immediately, his corporate credentials revoked, and he was escorted from the building by security. His termination was followed by a formal notification from the Department of Defense that he had been officially blacklisted from participating in any government contracting activities due to his unauthorized attempts to access classified materials and his deceptive conduct during the Pentagon briefing. The news of his dismissal and blacklisting spread rapidly through the defense contractor community, effectively ending his career in the sector. He attempted to return to commercial real estate, but firms were reluctant to hire an executive who had managed to destroy a $77 million division in less than a week. Meanwhile, under Gerald's leadership, the government division at Apex Defense Solutions flourished. The company secured the $47 million radar upgrade contract, and within 6 months, they had finalized agreements for the Aberdeen and Huntsville projects. The total value of the new contract secured by Gerald's division exceeded $94 million over 5 years, cementing Apex's position as the leading defense contractor in the region. The financial security allowed Gerald and Brenda to pay off the remaining balance of their mortgage 2 years ahead of schedule. Chloe Vance graduated from Oak Ridge High near the top of her class and was accepted into the engineering program at Virginia Tech with a partial scholarship. Toby Vance excelled on the varsity football team, earning athletic recognition that drew the attention of college recruiters. Gerald's former colleague Ronald, who had transferred to Apex during the asset acquisition, stopped by Gerald's office one afternoon to congratulate him. He remarked that Chad had believed that anyone could manage the division with a business degree, but had instead learned that respect and expertise could not be replaced. Gerald looked out his window at the Potomac River, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. He had spent 20 years building something of value, and when he walked out the door, he had proved that the true asset was never the company name, but the competence and integrity of the person doing the work. In the years that followed, the story of Brewster's collapse and Apex's subsequent rise became a classic case study in defense procurement circles. It was frequently cited as a warning to corporate boards who believed that specialized, relationship-based industries could be managed solely through standardized business templates and academic credentials. For Gerald, the victory was not about personal vindication, but about protecting the integrity of the work and the security of the nation. He continued to manage the division with the same dedication to transparency and technical excellence that had defined his Navy career. Every Monday morning, he would meet with Lawrence Dunlap and his team of engineers, going over the progress of their projects and ensuring that they were meeting their obligations to the military. Gerald knew that they succeeded because they valued the expertise of their people and the trust of their clients, principles that no business school degree could ever replace. As he watched his children succeed and his division grow, he knew that his choice to stand up for his professional respect was the best decision he had ever made. The transition of the former Brewster employees to Apex Defense Solutions was completed with remarkable speed and minimal disruption. Within a month, the engineers and project managers who had felt stifled under Chad's micromanagement were thriving in Apex's collaborative environment. They brought with them a wealth of technical knowledge and operational history that immediately enhanced the company's capabilities. Gerald made a point of personally welcoming each new employee, ensuring that they had the resources and authority they needed to perform their jobs effectively. The former Brewster offices, which Apex had acquired under the settlement, were updated to meet modern standards, and the atmosphere of tension and fear that had characterized the final months under Chad was replaced by a sense of shared purpose and excitement. Gerald was proud of what they had built, but he remained focused on the future. He knew that the defense industry would continue to evolve, presenting new challenges and opportunities. But with a team built on mutual respect and technical competence, Gerald was confident that Apex Defense Solutions would remain at the forefront of the industry for many years to come. A testament to the fact that some things are truly irreplaceable.